Hi, I'm Rob Cosman. Welcome to my shop. A properly prepared and sharpened chisel will allow you to go through a piece of eastern maple, not only effortlessly, but it's actually a pleasure to use. Now, my students often make mistakes, and as a result, their chisels don't perform like this. I'm going to go through and show you those mistakes, help you avoid them. Stay with me. But what I want to do is go through one at a time, some of the more common mistakes I see. I'll explain to you exactly what it is and how to avoid it. If you do it right, this becomes a very predictable, very precise instrument, and you'll be amazed what you'll be able to do with a properly prepared and sharpened chisel. This has to be issue number one, and it's probably the biggest problem, and that is not only getting the back flat, but knowing why it needs to be flat. What you want is, and what you'll see on this chisel is a highly polished, very flat back. Now, of course, you can take flat out to multiple zeros, but what we're needing to do is to try to get it as flat as humanly possible. Now, there's a way of checking that. And what I do is I stand underneath a fluorescent tube, and you get the reflection of the fluorescent tube on the end of the chisel going off on an angle. And if there's any distortion, if that image bends, then you know your back is not dead flat. Now, let's answer the question. Why do you want it to be dead flat? Well, when you're trying to do something that requires laying the chisel flat on the work, you want it to start engaging right there, meaning all you have to do is put a little bit of pressure on the front and it'll start to cut. Instead, if you're having to lift to try to find that engagement point as a result of having the back somewhat rounded, if you can imagine trying to be accurate when you're sitting up like this, you don't have any reference surface whatsoever. And that reference or that jig allows you to come in and engage and then actually be able to control the cutting edge going through the wood because you've got something referencing on there. Now, what do? Well, a good chisel comes from the factory flat, but not polished. So there's going to be grinding scratches on the back that come from the factory that you need to replace. And typically, like sanding, you're going to go through a series of grits. You don't need all of this done, but on our chisels, when you can remove the chisel back, you can, the chisel handle, you can lay it perfectly flat on the stone, and it's just that much easier to have the entire surface on the same plane, highly polished. As long as you get about 1.5 inches, that's probably all you need. And in some chisels, you really can't do the entire back, but this one you can. I walk it right up to 16,000. So if I start at 1,000, I get rid of factory scratches with 1,000, then I move from 1,000 up to 4,000 or 6,000, depending on what you have for stones. That chases away the previous ones, the 1,000. Then you move it up to 8, that chases away the previous ones, and then you eventually come to 16. And when you're done, it looks like a mirror. And you also want it, in order to get a good sharp edge, you want that surface to meet this surface. Now, I should mention something right away. You're familiar with the Charlesworth ruler trick. You see me talking about it all the time on plane blades or on scrapers, but never on chisels. You don't want anything varying out here at the tip that's out of line with the rest of the chisel back. That's all part of that nice flat back. If you get that part right, then you're well on your way to getting this chisel to perform exactly the way you want. And there's nothing like a nice sharp chisel. Oh my goodness, it works so well. Flat back, gotta have it. The problem with a narrow chisel, 1/4 inch or less, is that it has a tendency to roll. Here's what I mean. If you're working on your stone and you're moving this forward and back, if it's narrow like this, it tends to be taller than it is wide, or almost as, and has a tendency to roll, and it makes it very difficult to get that nice and flat. So what I do on chisels like this is I hold it on about a 45-degree angle, and that prevents that from happening. Now, I'll also mention that while I'm doing this, I have the tip in the middle of the stone, and as I move forward and back, I slowly migrate over towards my left, and then once I'm here, I'm going to migrate back to the center. Now what that does, particularly if you have a chisel unlike mine where you can't get the entire back on the stone, it gives you a blending area in here. If I were to stay right here in the middle for the entire process, this edge of the stone is going to cut a ridge somewhere in here. But by moving it forward and back and then sliding left and then back to center and then back to left, you get that blending area in right here. Now you can't go from center to right, because if you do, you've got no reference surface. You want to keep at least that much on the stone. Keep it at a 45-degree angle. I put the most of the pressure right here in the crest, and then a little less pressure on each one of these fingers. And this one is, I always try to keep this one over top of the stone. It's helping to push forward and back. But if you're out here, then you're having a tendency to bear down like that. I don't want that. So I keep these fingers over the stone and just move that forward and back. Center, off to the left, back to the center. I do that now with all of the chisels, whether they're wide or narrow. That way I never run into that problem of having the narrow chisel roll on me. Another problem with the prep work, I always make, out of a habit, set the heel down first and then drop the toe or the point of the chisel on. Same thing when lifting it off. If you get, I try to avoid anything where you're lifting up like this and putting, if you happen to do that when you're moving it like this and you lift it up, now you're dragging on that end. I religiously keep that as flat as possible out there. So always approach the stone, heel first, drop it down, and then when you're taking it off, lift it up off like this so that you're always bringing the tip off first, and then you never end up in a situation where you're going in to the stone and wearing away that leading edge. And since after every sharpening I come back to my final stone, you do that a fair bit. So get that habit, and then you never have to worry about the problems of not doing it that way. When you're dealing with sharpening a chisel, a narrow chisel like 1/8 of an inch, you can't treat it the same way you would a plane blade. And by that I mean, when I'm sharpening a plane blade, I'm sitting in on the stone. I've got 4 fingers creating pressure, applying pressure uniformly across the edge, and I can do circles like this. I got lots of width. If you try doing that with a narrow stone like this, you're almost always going to end up skewing it. It's so hard to balance. You have such small surface area there. So what I do on these, I still squeeze my fingers together so that both hands are tied. Find my primary, come up off of that, and little wee short strokes, little wee short forward and back strokes, trying to keep it as even pressured across that edge as possible. Don't do the circles, and you should be able to maintain that nice square edge. Now when it comes to freehand sharpening, there's a few things that you have to pick up in order to be able to do this right and do it consistently and get a nice result. This is my primary bevel, and a nice clean primary bevel means that when you set your blade, your chisel down on your stone, you can easily locate your primary bevel. That's 25 degrees. So by finding my primary bevel, I can then come up just a few degrees, and at that point I lock it. What I mean is I lock my wrists, I lock my elbow, and I pivot from my shoulders. On a chisel that wide, I can do little circles. If you don't want to do that, you can do little wee short forward and back strokes. Either way, do that until you can detect a slight burr on the back side of the blade. But I've got everything locked, and I often have my chisel resting against my wrist like this to kind of bridge this gap or strengthen this weak point, if you want to call it that. Just barely off of the, all you're going to need to do is just barely come off of your primary bevel. Usually only takes 5 to 7 seconds. You can pick up a little burr. As soon as you do that, you can move over to your finishing stone. Don't need any more than 2. A coarse stone to create the new edge, verified by the burr. A finishing stone to polish it. Find that same primary bevel. Now if I came up a couple of degrees here, I'm going to come up a couple more degrees over here. So I'm only touching the stone with the very leading edge. Same idea, either short forward and back strokes or little tight circles. Do that for another 5 to 7 seconds. That's all it takes. Flip it over. Remember, always come down heel first. Lay that down. Just a couple of seconds to remove the burr, and away you go. Nice, perfect edge. Now, if you have socket chisels, I always take the sockets off just to keep them from getting wet. But you got to bear in mind that this socket actually sits lower than the back of the chisel. So when you're prepping it for the first time and you're going, as I showed earlier, from the center over, you want to make sure that you don't accidentally come over here and engage that socket, which you would hardly even notice. And what that would do is lift up the chisel, and now you're wearing away right out here at the tip where it's so important that it remain flat. So you kind of have to make sure that you know where the end of the chisel is and you don't accidentally slide over and get that cone or that cone area up onto your stone. One of the other big problems I see is that people don't realize how these stones work. Now, these are ceramic. This would also involve water stones. They're made up of some form of an abrasive held in place with a bonding agent. And it's designed so that as you run the tool over the stone, the bonding agent is wearing away, constantly exposing fresh cutting particles. That keeps the cutting speed up. However, it also means that the stone is wearing away and it's no longer being flat. If you ignore that, you will eventually work into a dish surface, and then if your chisel's on the opposite side of the dish, it's going to be rounding up that back, and now when you go to do that fluorescent tube test, the tube actually distorts at the end, and that's most likely what has happened. So the simple solution is, on a ceramic stone, I wouldn't spend more than a minute before I would come in. Now I'm using the back side or the coarse side of a diamond plate. Come in, and it's 3 to 5 seconds is all it takes to bring that stone back to being flat. If it's a water stone, 30 seconds is all I use before I come in and flatten. Now, to get a little more wear out of it or to even it out, if I'm using a ceramic, and I'll go 30 seconds, moving from left to center, center to left. Now, this area is being used consistently. This area is somewhat intermittent. So at 32nd point, I spin the stone around and then just even out the wear. At the minute point, come back in, 3 to 5 seconds to bring it back to being flat, and then you'll maintain all that hard work you did so that when you're done, meaning when you get to your final stone, you've got a nice flat back and you don't have to go back to the coarsest stone and start over. This is going to be the last one, and it has to do with the bevels. So we typically use 3 bevels. This is our primary, and on a standard bench chisel, it's going to be 25 degrees. Then we're going to apply a secondary bevel on our 1000 grit stone, and that's usually going to be somewhere between 26, 27 degrees. And then our third, or our tertiary bevel, done on the finishing stone, the 16,000, is going to be up another 1 or 2 degrees. So you're sitting somewhere around 28, 29 degrees. Now, you need to make sure that each one is a little bit higher than the previous one. And if you happen to look, and if you see a shiny spot and then a dull spot, then what you know you've done is you actually didn't raise up as high on the third one as you should have on the second one. So you always want to have dull, which is your coarse primary bevel, then a little bit shinier, and then polished almost black out at the end, and that's your tertiary bevel on your finest stone. Now, when you also are learning, it's really easy to destroy this nice primary bevel. You've touched on the heel, you've touched on the toe, and the minute you've done that, you lose the ability to feel that very definite primary bevel. So I wouldn't hesitate to go over to my grinder, reestablish that primary bevel so that I can readily find that primary bevel when I come over to sharpen. That's my reference point for everything. Come up just a few degrees, a few short strokes, 5, 6, 7 seconds. As soon as you get a burr, come over to your finished stone, do the exact same thing except you're just a little bit higher. Come in, another 5 seconds or so. As a final step, lay that chisel down, heel first, onto your fine stone. Just a couple of seconds on the back, take it off, heel first. And now you've got an edge that will perform flawlessly. You'll have lots of control. It'll be highly predictable. You know exactly what it's going to do. Whether you're paring along horizontally or whether you're chopping vertically, you know exactly what the chisel is going to do. And that's the critical part of being accurate with a chisel, predictability. Good luck. If you like my work and enjoy my style of teaching, click on any one of these videos and help take your woodworking to the next level. I've always said, better tools make the job so much easier. If you click on the link below, the chisel and plane icon, it'll take you to our site and introduce you to all the tools that we actually manufacture right here in our shop. It'll also give you information on our online and in-person workshops.